The Marvel Cinematic Universe has managed to do what long was thought impossible to do in films and television, interconnecting various characters to build a grander universe, tell bigger stories, but also smaller ones as well. I'm starting to wonder if they may have peaked already. Hey folks, I want to talk a bit about the current state of Marvel. Marvel Phase 4, at least. As we get into this, I'm kind of going to end up focusing a bit on the Disney Plus streaming shows, but I do want to kind of talk about the state of the thing overall. I'm going to avoid spoilers for any of the more recent stuff. At time of recording, Thor Love and Thunder has only recently come out. I do have my review up if you want to see that. Don't worry, I give a spoiler warning in that before I get there. I will be talking spoiler stuff in something as recent as Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and anything prior to that. But that'll give you a sense of where things are in this conversation. And that also means Phase 4 is not done. It's debatable how far into it we even are at this point. It's kind of hard to get a gauge, which might be, honestly, part of the issue, but I'll get there eventually. Just so we know what we're talking about, let me go over Phase 4. What has been released so far, what we have dates for, and what has been announced, but we don't have distinct dates on yet. So in order of release, Phase 4 has consisted of WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, Black Widow, What If, Shang-Chi, Eternals, Hawkeye, Spider-Man, No Way Home, Moon Knight, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Ms. Marvel, and Thor Love and Thunder. Coming up later this year and getting into next year, we have She-Hulk Attorney at Law. There's the series of I Am Groot shorts. There were indications that there was going to be a Halloween special, but we still don't have a title and a date on that. Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. The Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. In 2023, we're getting Ant-Man and the Wasp in Quantumania, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and The Marvels, which is a follow-up from Captain Marvel. Confirmed, but not yet having any dates set, What If Season 2, Loki Season 2, Secret Invasion, Ironheart, Armor Wars, a series set in Wakanda, as yet untitled, and supposedly a Fantastic Four film. There's also Blade, which has no set release date. There's also The House of Harkness and Echo, which are spinning off of shows we've already seen, but those have no date, and we don't actually know if they'll be part of Phase 4 or a theoretical Phase 5. And there's also Marvel Zombies. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about Marvel Phase 4. So, what's the problem? First of all, let me be clear, problem is relative. The overall apparatus, at least for me, doesn't seem to be clicking or moving as well as it has previously. And let's be clear, as much as I love the MCU and I've loved how Marvel has managed its properties up to this point, the MCU has not been flawless. If you go back and actually go through everything that they've done so far, you can see where certain things had little hiccups, little ideas or notions or plans that clearly fell apart. Whether it be casting changes, whether it be things that were set up and never paid off. Phases 2 and 3 went pretty smoothly as far as these things go, or at least managed to have the appearance of being well planned and going forward smoothly. Then we've hit Phase 4 and things have been a little bit wonkier. If I were to point to the first thing that I would say might be the initial problem, it's the lack of Avengers films. Now, I'm kind of two minds of this because I get why they made the decision that they did, which is they have not announced a major team-up film. There is no announcement currently for a new Avengers movie. The last one was Endgame, and we have no more currently announced or planned, so we don't know how they're wrapping up Phase 4, where the demarcation point's going to be on all this. And honestly, I get why they made that decision. The Avengers films specifically got so big dealing with the threat of Thanos that by the time that ended, we had lost and then regained half the population of the entire universe. We had dealt with that major threat. We had lost permanently, either through death or the characters otherwise being retired, major players in this franchise. It's hard to go bigger than that. And continuing in the Avengers name, the expectation would be to go bigger or go as big. But if you keep going that big, even if you can't go much bigger, it's going to, as time goes on, lessen the impact of these things. You take it up to 11 over and over and over again, and it loses its meaning. So I absolutely understand why they have not had a new Avengers film either made or even announced. At the same time, I think what's starting to become clear at this point is having the Avengers series, the team-up series specifically, was kind of a key anchor. Because it was the thing that other things could be building towards or feeding into, but that was also kind of by design the franchise that you needed to watch the other ones for. Through definitely phase 1, and I would argue most of phases 2 and 3, despite a couple of crossover instances with specific characters, by and large, individual film franchises were pretty self-contained and could be watched on their own. There would be things that would reference events that maybe happened in Avengers, or there might be one character or two who showed up that hadn't been accounted for, but they would get explained within the context we had. Take, for example, Ant-Man. Ant-Man has his own franchise. He also showed up in Captain America: Civil War. He got explained as much as he needed to be. If you understand that you're watching a film that is set in a world where there are this many and possibly even more superheroes out there, then yeah, they can just show up. He got as much explanation as was needed, and the plot didn't pivot on him, so it was okay. And the ones who were completely new, those being Black Panther and Spider-Man, got more time and got proper introductions. Again, you could actually watch these things in a relative just isolation, each franchise. And with only a couple of exceptions, like arguably Civil War would be one, for the most part, it was really only the Avengers that you needed to have watched a bunch of other stuff to properly appreciate. But even then, if you weren't a fan of, let's say, Thor, you could watch the other shows and then watch Avengers or Avengers Age of Ultron or the later Avengers films and still get his deal without having to watch his movies. They were the central pillar around which everything else revolved. We don't have that anymore. And as a result, the interconnectedness is starting to feel more essential or possibly less well thought out. Since there is not that central pillar where everybody's going to come together, characters are showing up in each other's franchises a bit more casually, which in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but it doesn't feel like it's building towards something the way it used to. And part of that also has to do with the overall story that we have going here. Now, in hindsight, lots of people look at the Infinity Saga, as some people have chosen to label the phases 1 through 3, as building towards Endgame, and they honestly did not towards the tail end. They dropped little things that could be picked up later, and eventually, I think it was more in the favor of Infinity War and Endgame that they were able to take everything that had been done and make it seem as if it had all been building to this one thing, even though a lot of it was just tiny drop stuff, little throwaway lines here and there that didn't do much by themselves. But all those pieces got gathered up into a greater whole. Here, we don't have that. The closest we have to that is the concept of the multiverse. But that's being used in ways that don't feel like they're building to anything. They're being used in ways that are actually very isolated and self-contained. The multiverse effectively got introduced in Loki. Well, arguably even created in Loki or recreated. It depends on how much you want to believe Kang in terms of his explanation of what was going on. But assuming that all that is accurate, that basically kickstarted the multiverse. And so since then, we've had a couple of multiverse movies, the big ones being Spider-Man: No Way Home and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And those in theory connect to each other, except they kind of don't. Now, normally, as I kind of said before, that's not a huge deal. You don't have to have the Spider-Man directly impacting or be dependent upon Doctor Strange or vice versa. Like, that's a good thing. They should be more self-contained, except that when they're both dealing fundamentally with the exact same core concept, shouldn't they feel like there's more of a point to it happening in more than one place. Like the way the multiverse was used and the way it impacts things in Spider-Man is not the same way that it was used and impacted things in Doctor Strange, is not the same way that it was introduced in Loki, which doesn't feel like how it was explored in What If. And right now, these disparate ways that the multiverse is being explored just feel like, well, they just feel like they're running out the concept, as opposed to going anywhere. This might be a situation in which Marvel's being hoisted by their own petard a little bit, because the way in which they managed to build the first three phases to make it seem like it was always building towards something greater, the fact that we're not really getting that sense now makes it feel like an absence. Whereas if we were starting with phase 4, maybe it wouldn't be such an issue. But we have the previous phases for comparison, and it does feel like something's missing. Now, as I said, the ways in which these things are interconnecting is being handled a bit differently than it was before, and in a way that I think is actually starting to very directly hurt some of the storytelling, especially when it comes to the series, the Disney Plus streaming series. So the first one of those we had was WandaVision. Now, WandaVision was a really interesting concept. It was one of the few to have 9. Most of these only get 6 episodes. Interestingly, looking at it, the ones that either have had or are going to have 9 episodes appear to be the ones that, at least for part of their run, are more episodic. Because WandaVision starting out, these were fairly isolated episodes as they explored different decades of sitcoms. But then as it moved forward, it started to build more of a coherent, overarching serialized story. The other one that has already aired that had 9 episodes was What If, which again started out being very episodic and became serialized towards the finale. And then we are supposed to get 9 episodes for She-Hulk, Attorney at Law. Now, that hasn't aired at the time that I'm talking, but I would be shocked if that's not handled episodically, basically with Jennifer Walters, aka She-Hulk, handling a new case every episode. So the ones that seem designed to just be a serialized story are getting 6 episodes. Ones that have at least partly an episodic structure are being given 9. But coming back to WandaVision, I did a rather lengthy dissection of that. You can check that there. My main issue was with the ending. And I've complained about the ending in a different context before. My issue with the ending initially was that it really felt like Agatha Harkness as a villain. The fact that there was an external villain at all felt very strange. Because the villain seemed to be, by design of the story, Wanda's inability to properly and healthily cope with her own grief. And she was not taking into account the way that how she was trying to cope was hurting other people. That was kind of the villain, or at the very least, that was the problem. But then out of nowhere, a villain shows up and we have a wizard duel in the sky, and it felt so jarring. And I didn't like it at the time, and I like it even less as time goes on. Initially, I chalked that up to just some misguided notion that all these things have to end in action scenes. And I'm not going to say that isn't in the mix. It probably still is. But having now seen Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, there's another factor. Wanda had to be set up to have the Darkhold, and in the extra scene at the very end of that show, to be messing around with it in a sinister fashion so that she could be the villain in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. It feels very much at this point like the entire, I'd say, last 2.5 episodes of WandaVision aren't there because they're the natural extension or conclusion of the story of Wanda's grief, but because we have to create a situation where she gets the Darkhold and we can set her up as the villain for next time, and we can drop this whole prophecy about the Scarlet Witch. Because none of that stuff benefits the story of WandaVision at all. And, look, sometimes the interconnectedness stuff doesn't immediately benefit the story that it's in, but when you hinge the ending of the show on it, well, you're making it a massive part of it. This isn't an Easter egg. This is what you've twisted the story into being in order to set up other stuff. I'm finding myself having similar concerns with Moon Knight and Ms. Marvel. Now, to be fair, at the time that I'm recording this, Ms. Marvel has not had its final episode yet. However, even if its final episode is great, it still feels very much like it is being designed as just a way to cover the origin of Kamala Khan before she shows up in The Marvels next year. It doesn't actually feel like it has that much of a story to tell about Kamala Khan, about Ms. Marvel. It's covering a lot of lore, is what it's doing. And it started out being about her and focusing on her and her family and her social life and her interests and her as a person. And then it became family history, lore dumps, villains who were really oddly and in some ways very undermotivated, introducing characters and having them betray her immediately or get killed almost immediately. And it just feels like a rushed attempt to cover an origin story because they decided to give her a series instead of a movie. And similarly with Moon Knight, that one was a case where the rush basically all hit at the tail end. Whereas Ms. Marvel, assuming that the final episode is great, I would like it to be, but even if it is, everything crushed together and really weird pacing and this isn't flowing well is in about the middle, episodes 3, 4, 5. Whereas Moon Knight basically all got crammed into the tail end. And with Moon Knight, as with WandaVision, a forced ending with a villain that does not feel like the natural conclusion for this story about a man trying to sort out his own head. It's a little less jarring than it was in WandaVision, but not by much. The series that have worked the best so far, or at least the smoothest, are the ones that dealt with pre-existing characters quite heavily. With WandaVision being the big exception, but I've already gone over why that is. So that's Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which, at least in terms of fitting into the greater world, the greater MCU, I think is probably the best one. I'm not saying that it is like my favorite or that it's, the most rewarding or the best show, but strictly in terms of logistically fitting in, I feel like that's the best one by a bit because it tells a fairly completed story and it feels like it's telling a completed story and ends with Sam having taken on the mantle of Captain America so that when the next Captain America movie happens, he can already be Captain America. And if people want to know how he got to the point where he was comfortable with the shield, well, here's the show. But you can also start there since he was given the shield at the end of Endgame and you could theoretically skip the show and get the gist of what might have gone on in terms of, well, something happened where he's now comfortable having this mantle. Cool. You want the details? Here's a show. That I feel like slots in the best overall. Loki is probably my favorite in terms of enjoyment, and it's also a little bit of an odd duck because it's one of the only ones along with What If that is supposedly getting a second season, at least so far. Although, interestingly, Loki was not originally planned to have a second season. That was something that was determined as they were working on it. It was originally conceived to just be a one-off like everything else. But it exists in this weird realm of being fairly standalone, but also introducing the idea of the multiverse, except that when the multiverse has come up in other things as well, it gets reintroduced in things like No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness. So did it even really need to be set up here? Was it necessary? But with something like, say, Hawkeye, it feels a little bit like a way to sign off Clint if they feel like they're done with that character. It does introduce a new character, to be fair, but she's existing within the realm of established characters, so it still has that ground foundation that the stronger entries have. Right now, the ones that feel like they're on the weakest footing are the ones that are introducing new characters. And I can't help but wonder if it's because they're being introduced not to have their own shows, but just to be able to have them show up in the movies later and for there to be an explanation, which is something that I've cautioned about before. And I'm now legitimately concerned that Marvel is doing, which is to create movies where having watched the shows is kind of essential. It's arguable that they've already done that with Multiverse of Madness. To really understand what is going on with Wanda, like, it gets a little bit of an explanation in that movie, but not much. And it feels like a huge leap from where she was last seen in the films. Like, yes, she was grieving the loss of Vision, but how did we get here? And while I have argued already that they took her too sharply into villainy, you do at least understand how things got here purely logistically if you've seen WandaVision. But if not, what's going on? And I strongly feel at this point it's going to be similarly with the introduction of Kamala Khan in the Marvels. And possibly similarly if we ever get Kate Bishop in the films. Or if Moon Knight shows up again. I can't help but feel that these characters are just going to show up with little to no explanation and basically a token line establishing where they might have come from or what they did last time, which starts to become the film equivalent of something the comics done of ages, which is to put a little asterisk when characters in dialogue reference something that the reader might not know. To find out more, check out issues blah, 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 blah of this series, which in theory is part of the nature of the interconnectedness. But leaning on it that hard to the point where you start to feel like it's punishing you with a lack of understanding if you haven't followed everything, that's part of what turned me off of comics back in the 90s. Because the 90s were notorious about really leading into that way too damn hard. I don't know what it's like now. I never really properly got back on them. I read graphic novels on occasion. But this is also a problem I've started running into already with Star Wars. Because, to pull an example, the Book of Boba Fett, which I watched because I like Boba Fett. I like the idea of Boba Fett. I was interested to see what they were going to do with him. I know him from the movies. I don't watch all of the Star Wars shows. I never have. I've seen some of them. A lot of them haven't grabbed me. And so when I sat down to watch something called The Book of Boba Fett, I was actually largely enjoying it for the most part, and then suddenly it turned into The Mandalorian Season 2.5. And as someone who hadn't yet watched the second season of The Mandalorian, I was really annoyed and wondering why the hell is this here? And then towards the very end, they introduce a villain who I guess is a huge deal if you followed the Star Wars cartoons, the Clone Wars and Rebels and things of that nature, but who I didn't know, but was framed very clearly as someone who I was supposed to know, but I didn't. And so I felt like enjoyment was stolen from me as punishment for not having been a good fan and absorbing everything, even if I didn't particularly gravitate towards it or feel like it clicked for me. I was supposed to watch it all, and if I didn't, I wasn't going to know what was going on. Star Wars has already started to dip that way for me. And I'm now starting to legitimately get worried about Marvel doing the same thing. And even though I do watch all the Marvel stuff, that's just not healthy creatively. Now, I don't want it to sound like all doom and gloom. I don't want people to think, Vera hates Phase 4. I don't. There's some of it I really like. And honestly, I'd say the best thing about Phase 4 so far is they have been willing to bring in directors and allowing them to put their unique vision on it more. That was something that was honestly not really there in Phase 1 almost at all. Because the directors, while all of them did good work, none of them really put a particularly unique stamp except for arguably Joss Whedon on the first Avengers. But then later on, bringing in someone like James Gunn to do Guardians of the Galaxy, Marvel has started to open up about that, with then later getting a Ryan Coogler for Black Panther. But even as they did things like that, they were relying on people with a big history in television to handle sort of the main thing. That's where the Russo brothers came from, who took over for Captain America and then later the Avengers films. And I think that was actually a very smart move for the way things were working at that point, because as television directors, they were used to just coming in and taking characters and storylines and component parts that were already in the works from other, points that had already been established and figuring out what to do with them, as opposed to expecting to put their own unique stamp on every step of the way. But as we've gone forward and entered into Phase 4, I think they've made some really interesting directing picks and have let directors make films that feel like their own. Whether you feel those have all worked for you or not, I don't know, but I feel like I can see the influence of Chloe Zhao on Eternals, Taika Waititi on Love and Thunder. Granted, he got established in Phase 3 with Ragnarok, but Love and Thunder feels even more Taika Waititi than that one did, and especially Sam Raimi with Multiverse of Madness. For all my issues with that movie, what is best about it is what he brings as a director. He brings fantastic horror energy to that movie, and pretty much everything that's good about it ties into that. So Marvel is stretching its legs a little bit in terms of allowing directors a little bit more freedom in terms of molding something to be theirs. And that's good because you can look back to stories of phases 2 or 3 where some really interesting and or up-and-coming directors talked with Marvel but ultimately didn't do anything with them because they felt that they weren't going to be able to express what they wanted out of the project. And given that someone like Sam Raimi hasn't touched comic books since Spider-Man 3 and hasn't even really touched big budget filmmaking in a dang long time, the fact that they could court him back and he came out of it going, I had a really great time working on this, to me says they are possibly shifting to becoming more director-centric and allowing directors to put more of their own voice in it, which is a good thing. However, I can't wonder if that doesn't tie back to what I said before about there being a lack of that central pillar. Without a core guiding thing like the Avengers series of films were, and like the Infinity Saga was for everything else to be formed around, maybe allowing directors longer leashes is the only way to breathe more life into things. Because if there still was a core central thing that everything needed to be in congruence with, then maybe you wouldn't want people stretching out as far. That's speculation on my part. I don't know. But I will say that all these things that I've talked about, all these factors, the lack of a clear purpose, a clear thing that's being built towards, yet still banking increasingly on the interconnectedness when it doesn't seem to be building to a purpose, seems to almost be for its own sake. It's starting to feel like the machinery is grinding. The gears are not fitting together as smoothly as they used to. And again, they didn't fit perfectly smoothly before, but they were very good at kind of glossing over when things, had little shutters. It's harder to get as unambiguously excited as I used to about future Marvel projects. Just because I'm looking at the way that the interconnectedness is impacting them, and it doesn't excite me. It's starting to feel almost obligatory. Like, can we connect these things? Great, do it. But what if the story you want to tell is better done without connecting these things? And for my money, the ones that I've enjoyed the most haven't had a lot of connections to other things. Multiverse of Madness probably had the strongest. That's the film I've liked the least in Phase 4. I actually like Thor Love and Thunder the best. Appears to be a bit of a controversial opinion, but it stands on its own, and I love it for that. I think in many ways I'm looking back at Endgame and feeling like that would have been a good place to stop. I'm not saying I wish Marvel had, but that did, true to its name, feel like an ending. It didn't have to be a definitive ending. Obviously, it left things in place and characters in place for stories to continue. But in that way that it's like, okay, but the big important thing happened. Now we're just kind of playing out what people are doing in the aftermath. And there isn't anything inherently wrong with that, but it does feel less important, less momentous, a little bit less exciting. So those are my rambly thoughts and concerns and sort of where I'm at with Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I still intend to check these things out as they come out, and I hope to like all of them, but I'm getting nervous about the streaming shows especially, because those are really starting to feel like they are being built as support structures for the films as opposed to ways to actually explore these characters fully on their own. And in the cases where they start to do that, they get kneecapped in order to fit the films better, like with WandaVision. Potentially like with Ms. Marvel. Again, we've got to see how that plays out, but I'm nervous. I want to like these. It helped a lot seeing Thor: Love and Thunder. And again, I know a lot of people don't like it. I'm still kind of weird on why, but that energized me a lot, actually. That helped. And hopefully I really like She-Hulk because I love that character. But we'll see. There's some good, strong stuff coming out so far. Shang-Chi was great. I definitely want to see more from him. Eternals was interesting, if not quite landing perfectly, but it was weird in a way that I enjoyed. But Black Widow felt like a footnote and something that should have been in Phase 3. Multiverse of Madness frustrated me, and more as time goes on. No Way Home, fun as it was more of a celebration of its own individual franchise than anything else, and again, enjoyable, but hard to take as a consideration for where things go from here. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the state of Marvel Phase 4? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, and subscribe. Patreon is what pays the bills. That enables me to do this as my living and to sit around thinking about and then talking about and then editing all my thoughts on these to share with you folks. Any amount you are able to support is of great assistance. But even if you can't, the likes and shares and subscribes help me out. There's other things you can follow me on besides this. Twitch, I have novels, I'm on TikTok, etc., etc., etc. Don't worry too much about it, though. Because what I want you to remember, ultimately, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Now my thanks to my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Karak, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Udelki, The Oath of Boyd, Bernabulax the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Bookworm, Adam, RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Jay Gorley, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want to hear me possibly butcher your name, check out the rewards on the Patreon. And thanks to all you folks.